Oh yes, I've seen, brilliant, thank you everyone. I've seen some people have asked some questions which I think have deleted now because I accidentally exited the meeting, sorry about that. But some of you have said, can you have that document? Yeah, 100%, I'll send that out to you. And if you have any questions that you've been saying, please input them back in and I'll try and address them at the end. Because I realise there's a lot of information, it might be slightly different for you depending on the circumstance. Okay, yeah, so I was talking about woolliness, vagueness with regards to sort of requesting for any other person to assess your child's needs, and that other person could be an occupational therapist, a speech and language therapist, someone like that. The law says that if the local authority considers it a reasonable request, then they will do it. I mean, how do you quantify what reasonable is? It's a tricky argument, but it can easily be made, particularly if other professionals and the school are saying that actually a speech language assessment needs to happen or an occupational therapist assessment needs to happen. Okay, so a lot of it does rest on that educational psychologist coming in and the importance and the value of the information that they bring to the forefront, which is why it really frustrates me when some reports are just not quantified enough, are quite vague and quite woolly, because they don't actually give a true picture of what needs to happen. Just going over to the right hand side of this page, so by sort of week 14 to 20 you should at least hear whether the local authority is going to issue a plan. So there's basically 3 hurdles in this 20-week process. Number 1 is, will they agree to assess? Number 2 is, will they actually issue you with a plan, because they can decide that there isn't a necessity to do so. We tend to find it's more rare that happens, but Sheffield are pushing the luck on that one, and they are refusing to issue more so than they used to. So just be aware of that. But like at the hurdle 1, you do have your rights to appeal if they say no. So again, about week 14, you would get a letter if they were refusing to issue a plan, issue a plan with reasons for why they refuse, and your rights to appeal. So that's your golden ticket again. It's a little bit more complex, that appeal, but if you can demonstrate that your child needs what we termed earlier as special educational provision, which is basically provision that's additional to or beyond what a child in the mainstream school would normally receive, then a judge is likely to rule in your favour. Again, it's really high percentage turnover rate for families actually being successful in that appeal, so it's above sort of 85-90. But normally you get an assessment. It's that sticking point right at the beginning where they try their luck with trying to refuse an assessment, but if you've got one or had it overturned by the tribunal, they tend to follow through and issue a plan. So normally about maybe 14 to 16, I'm saying theoretically because this is what the law says, but actually we all know things, unfortunately, nationwide, and not to do with COVID at all, this was way before COVID. Delays always happened. Again, it's unlawful for delays to happen. This is a legal time frame. 20 weeks has to be completed, but again, because the law has loopholes in it, it's quite hard to actually tackle them on that. You can, just on that point, you can issue what's known as a judicial review letter, so a pre-action letter. Either approach a solicitor to do that, or I think SOS SEN do them as well, and so do we, and that prompts them and kicks them into shape and tells them what the legalities are and what they should be meeting. They do tend to issue it once you've kind of threatened that, but sometimes it feels like an empty threat, because actually if you were to go all the way with judicial review, that can take about a year. So you see, this whole process is actually flawed, but there are things like the judicial review letter to keep in your mind if you do need to prompt them to finalise or at least send you a draft plan, which is the next point of the process. So the draft plan should come to you sort of, like I said, around 4 months from when you applied for an EHCP. This is really, really crucial, and you need to look through it again in a lot of detail. And the main the main sections that you need to focus on are section B and section F of the plan. At the draft stage, your school won't be named. The idea of this is the law and the guidance that sits behind an EHCP says that you need to, not you, the local authority needs to consider what all your child's needs are first and foremost. That's the most important thing, making sure they're all accurately recorded in that EHCP, in those 4 areas we talked about earlier. And that's ultimately why I like to focus on those 4 areas at the point of application, because you're already formulating what could be that EHCP kind of document. So just to cover them again: cognition and learning, social, emotional, mental health, physical and sensory, and speech and language skills as well. Okay, so they're the 4 main areas really. Okay, so that's section B, and that's where you should see information on the details of your children's difficulties. It could be that the local authority hasn't approached other professionals and occupational therapy assessments or speech and language assessments haven't been done. Therefore, maybe some of those things or some of those difficulties haven't actually come out of the woodwork yet, and you don't. There might be more information that needs to be put into that document, and that's what we find quite regularly nationwide. And I'll talk a little bit about how to address that in a mo. And then section F is the provision. So how are your child's needs going to be met in school? And ultimately that then determines which school would have the capability and the resource to be able to meet needs in section B. So let me give you an example. So say your child had difficulties with expressive language. A provision to meet that need, if speech and language had assessed, would be a programme of direct speech and language therapy delivered for, I don't know, 10 weeks, 1 hour every 2 weeks by a speech and language therapist, for instance. Okay. Perhaps, I mean, it doesn't often happen if a speech and language therapist has been commissioned by a local authority, but perhaps perhaps you had evidence that said that speech and language provision had to be on site. And in actual fact, there's only a few schools that deliver speech and language therapy or have a member of staff like actually employed by the school, and it's all on site. So it's a bit like a funnel, that could automatically sort of limit different options and maybe make your options, say, I don't know, say you've identified like a specialist school, the only place that can meet need, but I'll talk about that in more detail later. It's just so important this document demonstrates exactly what your child needs in order to be able to name the most appropriate school or the only appropriate school to meet your child's needs. So after you've looked through that document, you can make amendments on it. Then you get 15 days to do so. Then you want to send it back to the local authority with your choice of school as well. So say they're not changing schools, that's fine, just put the school that they're at now. But if you're in a flux of transition, which is particularly pertinent at the moment, given that we need to be looking for September 2021 starts, then yeah, you need to be requesting that new school. Okay, and then following that, the local authority then have to send that document out to any schools that they think would be suitable, and also your choices too. So this is known as the consultation period, and it takes 15 days. The schools have to come back to the local authority and say whether they can meet need or not at that point. Okay, I'm going to go back to the presentation now, so bear with me. Stop sharing. I'm trying not to press the wrong button this time. I'm just going to have a quick look at your chat while I'm doing that. Someone was asked whether the presentation from last week went out. No, my plan was to send them all out after the 3 webinars, but if you need it earlier, we can absolutely arrange that. That's no problem. Someone else says, do children need to fulfill both criteria? My daughter has ASD but is not considered to have SEN, and the school SENCO says she does not meet the threshold for applying for an issue. That we hear this so often, and actually in my presentation I've got things that are unlawful to say, and that is one of them. She needs help in class and struggles academically. Yeah, okay. I mean, from what you've said there, absolutely 100% she you could apply for an EHCP. You don't even have to have a diagnosis for applying for an EHCP. You just need to demonstrate that your child might have difficulties, so special educational needs. It doesn't have to be in those 4 areas. It could be just one area, one difficulty. It doesn't have to span all of them whatsoever. And then the other point is, does your child need additional help in school? Well, by the signs of it, they do, or they might in the future as well. And actually, you might not be quite sure because an assessment hasn't been done. So to me, it sounds like your threshold, you would meet the threshold. But if you want to chat in more detail, you can book a 20-minute consultation with us and we'll go through it in more detail. Okay, sorry. Screen share. Right, back to the presentation. Here we go. Unlawful LA comments, and one of them is that. So yeah, first of all, what we hear a lot from local authorities, some local, some far, you need to wait at least 2 terms to apply for an EHCP. When I say apply for an EHCP, I mean the first stage, so week 0, applying for an EHC assessment first and foremost. Not the case, absolutely don't have to do that. I mean, your child doesn't even need to be at school in terms of, you know, an EHCP is meant to span 0 age to 25, if applicable. So what happens at school or not, it doesn't play any part in terms of the legality and the thresholds for applying for an EHCP. Your child doesn't meet the criteria. Well, really, they're 2 very, very loose criteria for them to meet. So like we said, do they or may they have SEN? And should they or might they need additional help in school? Those 2 points, that's it, you know? So, you know, for professionals to be saying that you don't meet the threshold is exceptionally unprofessional, because actually you can't quantify those 2 points in law anyway, because they might have, and they might have this. The only way to actually find out is by doing an assessment anyway. So no, your child needs to be assessed by an educational psychologist first. No, they don't. They absolutely don't. That comes as part of the assessment once you've actually had the request for an assessment agreed. Your child's too young. No, we've covered that already. 0 to 25. Your child needs a diagnosis. No, they don't. As long as you can be demonstrating that there are some difficulties happening and it's impacting education, then you can apply for an EHC assessment. What we find is you might be put off from applying because the local authority come back and say no. Like we've said already, the next point in that process would be to appeal, and the tribunal is likely to say yes. And remember, that's just for the assessment, but sometimes that's so crucial and all you need to actually uncover and unpick some needs that are happening that you just don't know about, or the school doesn't know about. So it actually helps the whole process anyway. So understanding an EHCP, I've gone through a little bit about what your draft plan should look like when you get to that point. Let me make this a bit bigger for you. I mean, the point of it, and the point of it does make sense. I can see why sort of the code of practice exists, but in practice it doesn't always work this way. But the idea is that you have aspirations for your child. So those aspirations could span, you know, even beyond sort of schooling years. So, you know, getting a job, having friends, having relationships, being able to live as independently as possible, things like that. And this plan is meant to facilitate those aspirations and make them possible. The next point, as we've discussed through that previous PDF, is what are your child's needs in those 4 kind of areas. Yeah, so this is the document after the assessment has happened. What have we discovered, and what are those real crucial needs that have been unpicked? Okay, outcomes. So I haven't touched upon this yet, but outcomes then need to go into an EHC plan. Okay, this is in section E, and they can be updated each year through an annual review process, and it's very much for the school to work towards them. It might be around certain areas of need that your child has, so maybe to this is going to be really woolly. I don't mean for it to be, because I hate woolliness, but for your child to develop social skills, or I don't know, that's a really bad example, but it's like a target, it's an aim, it's a goal. Okay, and then the provision in section F needs to be meeting any of the needs that your child has. So basically removing barriers to help your child achieve those outcomes. Okay, and then the school comes after that in terms of, well, can this school deliver all of those things? And that's a tricky one as well, which we'll touch upon in a bit, because there's a lot of legalities. There's a lot of schools that will say, nah, we can't do that. And actually, if it's a mainstream school, you have every right for your child to be there. And the local authority has to just supply the school with more funding to be able to make it possible. It might be that things that are written into your plan won't be possible in a mainstream, in which case you would then maybe look at specialist. This is an important point. I know it's only tiny at the bottom there, but the role of the local authority is just simply to collate and summarise that information. Time and time again, we see local authorities trying to impart their advice and sometimes changing some wording in EHCPs. No, like, this is why we have an assessment period. It's the professionals and what they say that needs to be put into that plan. And the local authority is simply the collator of that information. They're not assessing your child, they're collating and putting that information into an EHCP in a legal manner, or that's what they should be doing. Importance of getting your EHCP plan right goes without saying, but it can stay with your child up to 25 if deemed necessary. The plan should be reviewed and updated every single year because needs change. You can request a review sort of within 6 months of the last one, or an emergency review at any point if needed. That prompts any changes to the plan through a legal process. So if you do ever have sort of a point of crisis in terms of needing to change school, or actually thinking provision's not quite working, or you're seeing more difficulties or less, then you want to get that written into this legal document, because it is a legal document and that's how you're going to get the needs met. Okay, next webinar actually, so next Wednesday, we'll be talking in a lot of detail about annual reviews and how crucial they are to getting the provision continuously updated throughout the schooling journey. The plan needs to be based on professional evidence, not LA opinion. I think I've already said that. And the plan needs to be very specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Important to make sure the provision. So I talked earlier about maybe program of speech and language therapy being in the provision part, so section F. It needs to be smart, so that there's no room for doubt on the school's part, on your part, on the local authority part, as to what needs to basically be paid for and delivered to meet your child's needs. It is a legal document. I'm actually not going to go through this page because I think I've already touched upon the important parts, which is part B and F, and obviously I is the school placement, so that's very important too. They're all parts of the document that you can appeal if you're not happy with it, so they're crucial really. This will be in the presentation when we send it round. Okay, so section F, I know I keep banging on about it, but it's so important for so many different reasons. One, for matching that provision to an appropriate setting, and two, for actually having your child's needs met. And I suppose three, for making sure your school of choice is delivered the correct resources to enable them to meet your children's needs. Time and time again, we find, like I said, schools saying they're not getting funding, we can't do that, we don't have the resources or the funding to be able to implement. The law says that the local authority should be topping schools up if it's needed. Okay. So bad wording here. If you've got an EHC plan, you might be familiar with some of this terminology because it's certainly highly used nationwide. So let's take Freddie. Freddie will have access to a high level of individual support. So there's three things in that sentence that I have an issue with. So number one is access. What does that mean? So how often? How are they going to access it? Are they so independent that they can go and ask that member of staff for support? high level, well, how many hours are we talking? This is particularly important when we're talking about one-to-one support and individual support as well. So what does that look like? Is it a TA? What are they trained in? What are they going to be delivering to that young person or child as well? Second one, Freddie will have opportunities to learn social skills in small groups. Again, opportunities is unlawful in terms of that terminology there. What does that mean? How often? What's the frequency? How will he be enabled to actually access that? What type of social skills will he be learning? Who will be delivering those small groups? And how many people will be in those small groups? And this, unfortunately, is very, very common wording within your area. This is probably what you will see when you get a draft plan. And remember, all of the information comes, well, from professionals that have assessed your child during that period of time within the EHC assessment, so after week 6 of the last document that we talked about. So you've got an educational psychologist making recommendations. Those recommendations go into section F of the plan. And you might be able to see word for word, you know, it's come directly from that report, which is fine, which is good. You know, it's a professional making those recommendations, but actually has that professional not made them specific enough or quantified them enough to be able to determine what does high level mean? What is my child actually getting? Does it leave no room for doubt as to what should be provided? And unfortunately, we butt heads with local authorities at this point. So you as parents, local authorities and the educational psychologists regularly butt heads, and they don't want to commit to that kind of level of wording, even though the Code of Practice says that it's a necessity to do that. And you get into a situation where you know that the wording has to be as tight as possible, but where do you turn? Some families turn to actually getting their own reports done. So some families, particularly if you're going through appeal and you know that you need to make this plan as tight as you possibly can make it in order to demonstrate that tunnel effect that we talked about earlier, that no other school can meet need but potentially the one that you want. So you need to make this section as tight as it possibly can be, okay? So some families, and it shouldn't be this way at all, but they do commission their own reports. And it might be their own educational psychologist report, their own speech and language therapy report, or occupational therapy report as well. Okay. And then I suppose something else to bear in mind is a lot of local authorities say, we don't accept private reports. That's all very well and good, but a tribunal does. So if you have to challenge them on this section of the EHC plan, because actually it's having a direct impact on the school that's been written into the plan, then yeah, a tribunal will accept those reports. There's no issue with that as well, as long as it's a credible a credible person that's written them and it's a professional and they're bound by all of their kind of boards that they're associated with, then yeah, they would accept and consider that evidence at the very least. Obviously, a local authority could submit their further evidence, and a tribunal might decide to go with the local authority's set of evidence, but ultimately they will always consider your evidence and not just blanket refusal from the local authority. If you have had reports done and you submit them to the local authority, just knowing what Sheffield is like, I suppose unlikely to write them all into the plan. We have had cases where they do though. There are a few changes in Sheffield at the moment, and they are positive changes. But we see cherry picking effect. So maybe they might put one bit of provision in, but not the other because the other's a bit more expensive than that one. So yeah, it's a minefield, but ultimately that in itself would be a good line of argument to use if you had to take it further to appeal and say, well, the local authorities included all my needs for my child from this professional document that I've commissioned, but not all of the provision. So they're clearly accepting what this, what this professional is saying about my child, but they're not accepting the recommendations. That doesn't make sense. And we've had many appeals like that, and it's, the tribunals just instantly turned it over because of that. Sorry, went off on a tangent, but I think it was an important one to say that, you can get your own professional reports done, and sometimes that's a fast track way to getting a good EHCP. I say fast track way because the whole process is really lengthy anyway, so it will take time. Appeals take time, but ultimately, you know, sometimes you can't, unfortunately, because of the woolliness and the vagueness of the legalities around assessing criterias and, you know, trying to get the local authority educational psychologists to make it as specific as possible. It doesn't always happen as quickly as we'd like, or at all in some cases. Freddie needs a small setting. Sorry, just going back to the slide. What does that mean? Does that mean the physical classroom or the number of children or the building? Like, we need more detail. Freddie should be referred to speech and language therapy. That shouldn't be included in the HC plan. That should have already happened. That should be part of the assessment process. But time and time again, we see it put into section F as if it should happen thereafter. But no, the point of an assessment period is to gather all the information from all the different domains, those 4 domains that we talked about, in the first instance, and then write those recommendations into section F. Speech and language therapy, by the way, should normally be in section F and not the health section, even though it might be the NHS assessing. Okay, an occupational therapist should assess Freddie's need and feedback to the school. Similar, exactly the same, really. Assessment, so the term assessment has actually been deemed as a word that is unlawful to put into the EHC plan on the basis that assessment should have already happened. Content of the plan, woolly, vague, all those words that we've just talked about. Sorry, that should say, would the school or professionals involved be left with no room for doubt as to what should be provided? If you're looking at your draft plan and your school's like thinking, I'm not really sure, what does that mean? Or you're thinking, how do I interpret that? Likelihood is it's not clear enough, so you must challenge it. Some case law here, I'm just going to quickly go through this, but this is good information if you need to challenge, particularly the quantified and this, like the specifics of section F. So it's not permissible to leave provision unspecified or unquantified, simply to allow for flexibility in schools' approach or arrangements. So a lot of the time local authorities will say, well, the school do it, they all do it different, so I'm just going to leave it vague. That shouldn't happen. The real question is, so this comes from case law, the real question is whether EHCP is so specific and so clear as to leave no room for doubt. That's why I keep coming back to that wording, because that is actually in black and white as to what has been decided and what is needed in the individual case. Words like as appropriate, required, as required, regular, periodic, subject to review, all illustrate illegality. We've talked about this already, but relying on assessments to happen and advice to be sought in the future, we can't guarantee that that's actually going to happen, so it gives you no right. So it has to actually be fleshed out in detail in the here and now and put into that section F. Things to quantify. So if I was you and I'd received a draft plan, I would want to be sort of looking to see whether there was any of that wording that we talked about before, but whether we could quantify things further in terms of maybe small class sizes. So maybe that's discussed in your section F. Maybe class size in general is actually really, really important to your child, and maybe the education psychologist said that small class sizes are important, but how many does that mean? Like, we need to quantify this to be able to actually determine what school is appropriate. Class size is a biggie. So if, you know, obviously mainstream schools, they normally have 30 children in, but if your child can't be educated in a class size of 30, that in itself is an argument for why mainstream can't meet need. But if it's not written in the plan, then that mainstream school will presume that things are fine through the consultation phase. Do you see how it kind of links up and it adds together? If your child needs to maybe hang back a year, or maybe that's been recommended by, I don't know, maybe one of your private professionals, if you have gone down that route or been able to, then you can specify a placement in a different year group. Therapy and intervention and any involvement from other professionals, so that's speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, maybe CAMS input, anything like that. Staff qualification and experience, so what's the skill set for educating and delivering provision for your child? Does that staff member need to have certain qualifications to be able to teach your child, deliver interventions like speech and language therapy? So you'd be looking at maybe, I don't know, a specialist speech and language therapist in autism, for instance. If that had been a recommendation by a professional, that needs to be written in there. And where small group work is needed, what's the size? So sometimes we see educational psychologists saying they need to work in small class sizes, like on the side of normal sort of day-to-day provision education. So maybe to have social groups. Well, what's the size of them? How many can be in that? What's the frequency? And who's going to deliver them as well? Okay. Yeah. So each one of the reason why I've included this list here is because there was actually a case law on each one of these different points. So basically it means that the tribunal system has ruled on each one of these points in favour of the, I can't say the word, specificity to be included in section F of the plan. So amending your EHCP, say you've got a plan, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but you know, your child is about to move to a new school. So say you've got a plan now, I would hope that an annual review, and your child is moving, sorry, in September next year, I would hope that an annual review had already happened, because the reason for this, and I'll send this out so you've all got it, is if your child's moving into primary or into secondary, then the legal deadline is the 15th of February for naming a new placement for September this year. That date is the same for subsequent years, so next year it will be the same as well for September next year. So again, we'll be talking about annual reviews in more detail at the next webinar, but it's really important in terms of time planning for the future as well. The point of an annual review process is to have a look at the whole EHCP, see if any amendments need to be made, maybe you need to make changes to that plan, and then you also request for the new school to be named as well at that point. Okay. But yeah, like I said, we'll be talking that in more detail next week. If you've got any individual questions, maybe it's that crisis point, because we're not far away from the 15th of February. So it really is important, you know, if you've got an EHC plan and that hasn't happened, then do get in touch via our 20-minute consultation, which I'll post in the chat in a minute. Touched on that already, but private reports can be included in EHCP. Okay, this is just a scenario, but I thought I'd go over it anyway. Say you want a special school and you've identified one for, you know, September next academic year. These are the things that you need to consider. So this presumes that you've gone through the 0 to 20 week process of securing an EHCP. So say you've got that plan for your child already. Does your EHC plan fully and accurately paint a true picture of your child's needs? Okay, needs and provisions should be established before the local authority name a new school. Deciding on an institution. So provider of your choice should demonstrate how they can meet need, okay? And they'll have your EHC document in front of them, and they'll want to, from their own perspective, make sure that they can meet need. But if a particular school that you want is maybe challenged by the local authority, they need to be demonstrating how they can meet need. So the law then says that the local authority should actually progress with your placement of choice if they consider it to be suitable, okay? That enrolling your child does not have an impact on the efficient education of others. So by that, I'll give an example. Perhaps the school is full, and we're seeing that so often around Sheffield at the moment. So perhaps the school of your choice is at full capacity, and enrolling your child would actually push numbers beyond it being safe. So potentially they would have to split the class. And potentially, in some cases, we've seen this, they might need to employ a new member of staff to look after that other class, and maybe even build a new building so that they can be in there. So that would be an impact on the efficient education of others. And then finally, and this is the biggest one used by Sheffield at the moment, it's not an inefficient use of resource. So your choice isn't basically unnecessary money, if that makes sense. So it's all about money. So what the local authority will be looking at is your plan, very much focused on section F. Can all of those provisions be delivered by a different school for cheaper? And if they can, then that's more of an efficient use of resource. You need to be demonstrating that they can't. And that's why section F is so important, to get as specific and as quantified as possible, if particularly you're wanting a special school. So when can parents appeal? We talked about the 3 hurdles. So refusal to assess, very easy to get it overturned if you know what you're doing. I think it's 96% of appeals are successful. Refusal to issue, so that's about 14 weeks. If the local authority sends you a letter and say, no, we've done an assessment, we're not going to issue a plan, we think it's fine, you can appeal then. And then the content of the plan, and I think a few of you are going through that process at the moment, so the likelihood is you're appealing parts B and F, and potentially section I as well, which is actually the school. So important to be appealing those 2 other bits to be able to demonstrate why no other school can meet those needs for cheaper. Leading up to a tribunal, we've already touched upon this, so annual review, we're talking about that more next week. You get a final plan. They'll either have made amendments to that plan or not. Either way, they'll send you a letter. That letter again is your golden ticket for going to tribunal, so you have rights. Okay, you'll get when you get a new final plan at whatever stage you're at, you'll get the school that they've decided on at whatever point, and you can challenge that as well. I think that's an important point. It's easy to think, well, the only thing that I'm quibbling is school placement. Like, they haven't named the school of my choice, but actually you need to go back and have a look at that document. If a school that was consulted looked at that document, would they actually have a realistic idea of what needed to be provided? Or actually, is a lot of that woolly wording in there, and there is doubt to what should be provided? And actually, we know, as parents, the school would have to provide a lot more. Timeframes for appeal. I realise we have done the hour now, but I'm going to continue because I think this is so important. So if you are able to stay, please do. If not, we will send this round, so you'll get it anyway. So from receiving a final plan, whether this is your first time going through the process or whether you've had an annual review, then you can, as a family, submit an appeal against the content or the school placement, and you have 2 to 3 months to put that appeal in. The reason why it's 2 to 3 months is because it's 2 months from the date of the letter that you've received, or a month from the date of a mediation certificate. Which I'll talk about on the next page, actually, what mediation is. Okay, and you could, if you needed more time, you could work it so you ended up having sort of about 3 months to prepare. Not that I think you would need it. So one of my tips actually is don't delay. If you are thinking about a new school for September, I would get your appeal in ASAP as soon as you've got that final plan, or subsequent years. Just do it as soon as possible. The whole appeal tribunal system is sort of taking, I'd say, maybe 5 months from the point of actually submitting an appeal. This is just for the content of the plan, by the way, not for refusal to assess. That's a lot quicker. But for actual content and school placements, it's taking about 5 months from submitting that appeal to actually having it heard and getting a decision. So if you felt like you needed more time to prepare, well, actually, you've got at least 3 months before any final evidence was due to get things in. The family in LA, we talked about that. The family in LA will be issued a final evidence deadline. So that's basically you demonstrating why you don't agree with the EHCP. It is important, it's crucial actually, to rely on evidence from professionals at this point. So you need to be demonstrating why you don't agree with things, not just because of your opinion, but relying on professional opinion for those points, and maybe even, well, definitely stating what the wording should actually say in that plan based on that professional. Okay, The local authority will submit a response to your appeal in the first instance as well. And then it's the local authority's job to collate all the evidence and put it into a big bundle. I say a big bundle, but actually they're being submitted electronically at the moment anyway. So that's your evidence, their evidence, and that gets sent to the judge for consideration. This is an example of a timetable, and again, this is a timetable for if you were challenging that final EHCP after you've gone through it and after you receive the final with the school named. So you can see in this instance, 8, 9, there's a relatively short time frame in this instance, but this was in 2019. At the moment, the timeframes are about 5 months, like I said. You can see the actions on the left-hand side from the local authority, what they need to be doing. So sending their attendance form in, sending a response, and also supplying what we call a working document. So basically, we're going back to basics and turning that education, health and care plan back into a draft. So that's basically what a working document is. And it gives you the ability to amend it using a certain code. So like bold, but you can actually manipulate that EHCP based on evidence and change the wording in that document, again, as long as you're always basing it on professional evidence that you have to support why that wording needs to be changed. All right. That document, in essence, needs to be bounced back and forth with the local authority until you can close on as many disputes as you possibly can before the point of actually going to tribunal. The next point would be to submit further evidence. It's normally by noon on certain dates, and we normally find the local authority submit it 5 minutes before noon, so you normally don't get a chance to have a look at what their evidence is before you submitted theirs. But that you'd really need to include details of how your school of choice could meet need if you're challenging the placement, and exactly why you're making changes to the plan. So why have you edited it? You need to be bringing it constantly back to professional reports. If you have the ability to budget for private professionals to come in and demonstrate that and make it as specific as possible, then that's the best way to do that. Okay, next one, attendance form, straightforward really. And then the bundle. Yeah, I just said it's meant to be 12 weeks, but don't be fooled, it can take longer. Mediation, just a quick one on this. I realise a lot of you are at the very start of the process, so this might mean nothing to you at the moment, but it's good to have in your sights because you could end up here. You have the chance to basically sit down with an independent mediator. They sit between you and the local authority. I mean, I say sit, but most of them all of them are being done virtually at the moment. The pros of doing this are you might come to a conclusion with the local authority before even having to go to an appeal. The cons are the process is not legally binding, so they could say and agree to something, but then not actually do it. We find there do seem to be more cons than pros in the process. At this point, I'm yet to really see a positive mediation. At this point, so this third hurdle, sometimes if you go to mediation at refusal to assess, they overturn, but more likely than not at this point, there's too many disputes and they don't agree. It can delay things, and that's what I hate about this process, is it can delay you from submitting your appeal when actually the process is going to take 5 months. So we prefer to actually talk with the local authority, which is what mediation is. Sit down with them, negotiate after you've submitted that appeal and after you're within a legal time frame, because that makes so much more of a difference. And you might not end up going all the way to tribunal. You might be able to conclude it with the local authority, but at least you're within a legal process, so they can't get away with things, basically. Okay. So tips: do not delay in submitting appeal. So if you do get, and that's at any point, if you do get turned down in terms of an assessment, submit all your evidence to the tribunal services, and hopefully they can get back to you pretty soon and successfully overturn the local authority's decision. If you're not sure about whether your case is strong, remember it's those 2 points in law. SEN, do they have SEN? May they have SEN? Do they need help in school? May they need help in school? And you can always give us a ring just to double check sort of your evidence as well with regards to that. If you're challenging the content of the plan, that is a lot more complex, but don't be put off and do submit as soon as you can. You might feel like you need to rely on your own professional evidence, and get assessments done. You've got 5 months, remember, from start to finish, so still submit your appeal, and then get those assessments done if you've got the budget to do that over the first couple of months. Professionals and good professionals get booked up really quickly. We have a list of professionals that we use, so I'm happy to submit those out as well. It's just worth just having a word with them and speaking to them if you do have a draft plan at the moment and you think it's going to go towards appeal. You just don't think it's good enough, and it is, largely unlawful. Yeah, okay, that's it. I'm so sorry I've had to squeeze so much in. I could talk forever on this matter and topic, and there's so much information to digest at different points of the journey. So I really urge you, if you do need sort of clarity over your own specific circumstance, to get in touch with us. Let me just put the consultation. Hang on a second. I can see there's quite a lot of questions which I might have to answer individually, because there's quite a few. Let me just write this down so you can book a consultation with us. Like I said, it's completely free. It's 20 minutes, no obligation to use us thereafter. We're just there to sort of point you in the right direction. Or if you did want to use us and you need to appeal or whatever, then just let us know, and that's fine. So okay. Oh, I don't think I've sent it to all of you there. Hang on. Sortents.co.uk. Hang on a second. Okay, so on the first page of our website, it says, I think it says like book a call with us. You can click on that and you can select a time directly in my calendar to chat with us about your individual case. And for some of you, I can see that your cases are quite complex, or you've got some worries about them, so please feel free to do that. I'm going to just have a quick look through. If you need to go, please feel free and do go. Like I said, we'll be sending this recording around anyway, so any questions that might be applicable to you, hopefully you'll pick up on them afterwards. Okay. Yeah, so someone said, this makes me so cross. That was with regards to the SENCO saying that the child doesn't meet the criteria for applying for an assessment. It makes me so cross too. Please do it yourself. Just get that application in. It's good to have support of the school, but if not, just do it. She said, this lady here said, did it herself twice for 2 different children. They agreed to assess both times. So, it can hopefully be smooth sometimes if you do it yourself. Yeah, okay. So we've got LA finalised plan before consultation period up, despite us emailing them our concerns and amendments, and ignored our emails. Draft plan sent out on 14th December, then finalised plan on the 18th December and sent it out. Yeah, and this is awful as well, because we sometimes find that when you get to the draft stage, the local authority has spent so flipping long hanging on to that plan that they're outside of their timeframes for complying with the 20-week process. So even though they've spent weeks and weeks on end trying to put something normally quite rubbish together, they then give you less than the minimum. By the way, the minimum is 15 days to consider and amend that EHCP and send any comments back. So yeah, that would, it is what local authorities do, unfortunately. But I suppose at least you've got the final plan and your rights to appeal. Sometimes what we find is they hang on to the draft plan for such a long time, and they take such a long time sending the final out. So you might be sat there with this rubbish draft plan, knowing that you want to appeal, but not having the rights in which to do so. So not having your golden ticket. So that letter I was talking about that gives you your passport to putting an application in for an appeal, and you've got to threaten judicial review. So that pre-action letter to actually prompt them to send the final plan out. But yeah, in both circumstances, it is unlawful. If you did feel like you needed longer than the 15 days, remember it is a minimum. I mean, my motto is don't delay in any event. I think, you know, even if you do have amendments to make to that plan, it might sometimes be better addressed through appeal. And the quicker you do that, the better. But it's a minimum, and the code of practice which surrounds everything to do with the HC plan says that. So if you want a meeting with the local authority, request one, and they have to, they're obliged to doing that meeting before a plan is finalised. So that could be like a good delay tactic, if that makes sense. Yeah, so social care. We've got someone here, Anna, saying that we haven't had any interaction and interventions from social care. I would put a request in. I don't know what point of the journey you're at, Anna, but something we need to, you're saying, is this something that we need to do ourselves beforehand? I would put a request in for a social care assessment to be generated, and you can do that at the point of the EHC request if you're not at that point yet, or thereafter, or you know, during the assessment period as well. It's not very clear through the guidance whether the social care process should be separate or incorporated into the HC plan, but the way most people interpret it is that it should be in conjunction, and particularly as, you know, it's an education, health and care plan, that information should be put into the plan at that point and sort of, you know, done alongside one another. So assessment should be happening. Okay. So someone else is saying, so you've got a final plan and the local authority are not willing to accept our independent educational psychologist as it is quantified and exact in support needed. Yeah, and it's horrible and very cynical of me to say, but I do tend to find that the local authorities don't like to put that kind of wording into a plan, because ultimately, if there's no room for doubt as to what should be provided, then they have a bill. They know exactly what they need to be providing. You know, one-to-one support for 32.5 hours a week, speech and language therapy for 30 hours a year. It's there in black and white, and they know that there's going to be a hefty bill associated with it. That's my cynical side, but it does seem to feel like that nationwide. And, you know, whilst a local authority might not be willing to accept it, a tribunal will. Is it best to get privately commissioned assessments done before applying or requesting an EHC assessment? I would say no. So I would just get that request for an EHC assessment in straight away. Obviously, it depends on sort of your evidence at the moment, but because it's such a low threshold, I would be hopeful that you would be able to put together an application that would at least allow you to be assessed. I would then probably at that point, if you've been refused, maybe look at getting a privately commissioned assessment done. But ultimately, the main purpose of those professional reports would be to look at the content of the plan. So sometimes we find families have maybe spent some money on private individuals to assess needs, to demonstrate why your child needs a plan. But actually, if you're going to do that, you might as well get them to do a full assessment as if your child's going to get an EHC plan, and determine exactly the content they think should be in that plan, obviously in line with their professionalism and specialism as well. It's a really tricky one, because obviously what we find sometimes is, are you giving your hand? Are you giving, you know, what's up your sleeve to the local authority to then counteract before you've actually given evidence if you eventually have to go to appeal? So I would it is tricky. I'd maybe leave it to the assessment period before getting an educational psychologist one done yourself. Maybe at least have sighting of the local authority educational psychologist, for instance, if you're thinking an EP. And anything else, and then get it done then. And if you're aware that they haven't even looked at SLT or OT, then yeah, in that assessment period, get them done. You could submit those, you know, at the draft point or before, but you know, you do run the risk. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be a game. but you run the risk of, I suppose, giving your information like that you're going to rely on potentially through a tribunal early, and then they could do groundwork to making their evidence even stronger for why they don't, your child doesn't need X, Y, and Z. Yeah, it's tricky, but I'd probably be most inclined to submit it maybe at the draft stage or a bit before, and then if they don't include it, take it to appeal. Okay. Yeah, so this is the other thing. Obviously, an EHC plan, and I haven't mentioned this, so this is a good point. An EHC plan is legal for 12 months. So sometimes you can end up in a battle after 12 months. So in some cases, local authorities try and remove provision because maybe you've been through a tribunal and it was directed that provision should be put into the plan, and now the local authority is trying to remove it because that's what they do. So sometimes it can be a fight to keep it in. Don't let that put you off though. If there's really good evidence for why they need that information, that provision put into the plan, then it is quite hard to remove. But yeah, it can sometimes be an issue at annual reviews. On the flip side, I've attended many annual reviews where after tribunal, so say 3 years ago, we've won a specialist placement for a child, and the local authorities completely washed their hands, like, oh well, never mind, and just forgets the child. So they're like, oh well, they're in specialists, they're fine, we'll catch up on them in 3 years' time when we're going to pull them out. And that's not right either. It's a balancing act. You want the local authority to at least be doing the annual review paperwork, which we'll be talking about next week. Otherwise, it could have an impact at the end of the placement, quite catastrophically, actually. And we've had many cases of that recently. Oh, someone said, I missed you because you froze. I'm not quite sure which bit you missed. Sorry, Claire, but hopefully with the recording, you'll be able to take a look back. Rachel, Ruth, I've had mixed messages about the value of private reports. What did you take on it? Well, you need to get a good professional involved. So there's no point getting someone on board that is actually not going to quantify and specify or even do the level of assessment that I would be wanting them to do. You don't want it to be pulled apart. And that's why we as an organisation have actually quality assessed and assured a number of professionals to make sure that they are the kind of professional that is going to write and going to assess in an appropriate manner, so that information is not going to be turned away by a tribunal if you're in that tribunal situation. It's so important. There's no point wasting your money. We do find quite a lot of professionals maybe offer to do things in clinic, or it's hard at the moment, like lots of professionals are saying desktop assessments because of COVID. Obviously there's a bit of flexibility around that because of the circumstance, but we need to make sure that the appropriate assessments are done and then that person is qualified in the advice they are recommending. So sorry, Rachel, that's quite vague, but basically my point is if you get the right professional, it's invaluable because it could change your life in terms of getting the right intervention written into a plan through tribunal and potentially getting the school that you want. So it's all about the right professionals. Okay, so someone said, Flora has said, how can you find out what provisions are available? I've heard that there are lots of options, but if you don't know what is out there, you do not know what to advocate for. So do you mean sort of placements, or do you mean provision, sort of like speech and language therapy or occupational therapy or things like that? It depends which side you're sort of thinking of. I always find that if you have an overview, so an overview assessment done by an educational psychologist, again a private one, I'm sorry to say, they're really good at pointing you in the right direction of actually your child could benefit, that's a bad word, make sure your professional's not using that word, but could benefit maybe of having an assessment done by another professional who can actually tell you that, I don't know, a certain strategy is going to work for your child, or a certain program is going to work for your child within different domains, so looking at it holistically. So that EP is really good in the first instance for helping point you in the right direction. In terms of placements, if that's what you mean, everything should be on the local offer, which is on every local authority's website. And yeah, you've got sort of your mainstream, your specialist, your training opportunities, your apprenticeships, things like that. It depends what age your child is as well. But yeah, ultimately, you're right, you're not going to know unless someone points you in the right direction as to what should be tailored for your child, if that makes sense. But a good starting point is that EP. Okay, so we've got Jennifer. Where do diagnoses go? You put B as a question mark. Yes, B is normally where they should be going, so section B. Why is Sheffield writing ASD as primary but now adding SEMH in secondary needs instead of the other needs? I don't know. I'm sorry. And to be honest, if it went to tribunal, that primary and secondary doesn't mean anything. I don't really know why they're doing it, because it doesn't have like any impact on sort of what's a priority and what's not. In actual fact, anything that's written in section B should be prioritized, so you can't really compare. It's very, very odd wording from Sheffield. Sorry, I can't sort of give you any more clarity around that, but ultimately I haven't challenged it because it doesn't really matter in terms of legalities, because a tribunal will just be like, well, you know, everything's a priority, everything that's in section B is legally binding. So okay, Flora, oh, you didn't hear my answer because you've had to go. Hopefully you can catch up on this. Someone else has gone as well. Yeah, lots of people gone. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so oh, sorry, I've just got Jennifer in capitals. The LA did not work with us during the 15 days, told us any amendments would have to be done through appeal. What do they think the 15 days is for? Yeah. Yeah, other people have gone through appeal. Annual review question. Review June 2020, plan issue December 2020. Now next annual review set for February 2021. Okay, school were named against our wishes and theirs. Okay, so yesterday we should delay annual review as any further amendments will be rejected. No, I would go ahead. I mean, it depends on what you want the outcome to be. If you're wanting changes to be made, then yeah, annual review is your way to go. Sarah, I would book a call because that is obviously really imminent. We're in the end of January. Annual review is your way to change things. The local authority can reject, yes, but you can appeal as well. Gaynor, can you cite at tribunal the stress and any subsequent mental health deterioration of your young person because of delay in naming school? Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great as well if you could get that written by professionals to demonstrate the impact it's had on a child. Oh, Jennifer, yeah, don't forget to consider your time frame for appeal, as independent professionals may not be able to assess for up to 8 weeks if they are booked up and it takes time to write reports. That is true. However, I would still recommend to submit an appeal as soon as possible. And if you're having trouble booking a professional in, so that you can submit evidence in line with the timeframes, you can submit a request for change form, which pushes your date on further. And yeah, we're yet to see one rejected. The local authority has to agree to it, but they generally don't disagree. And particularly sort of with COVID at the moment as well, tribunals are accepting that things might be taking a little bit longer. So get it registered, at least you've got it in the system then. Independent provision is not on the local office site in Sheffield. It should 100% be if it's on section 41. Section 41 is basically part of the Children and Families Act. Any independent providers that are registered on this Secretary of State list need to comply with the same kind of legislation, well, the Code of Practice, SEND regulations, etc., that any other mainstream or other body should do. If they're not on Section 41, so there are a number of provisions in Sheffield that aren't, then yeah, you're quite right, that's likely to be the case, that Sheffield don't talk about them. So yeah, there will be a number of other areas. Don't be put off, I suppose some people as well, like we've had a lot of consideration for private schools at the moment, so independent prep schools, they can accept EHCPs as well and have it paid for that way as well. Book a call if you're interested, if anyone's interested to know what some of the independent schools are, but unfortunately our provision around this area is actually quite not great at all. Mel, we are the same with our annual review. March 2020, draft plan issued December 2020, no final yet. Oh my goodness. Pre-action letter is what you're going to have to do, Mel. Hopefully it would push them in the right direction, but yeah, we hear it all the time and it's not on at all. Okay, that is us done on, oh, hang on. Question and answer. Okay, so some people are just asking about annual reviews. We'll be discussing that at the next webinar, so we'll touch on that in more detail. We've answered Anna's question about social care services, and Amanda has asked whether she can zoom in on the document. I'm really sorry you said that at 2 p.m. I don't think you can do that function on Zoom here, but hopefully when we send it around, you'll be able to see in more detail, and the PDF actually comes as a document where you will be able to zoom in. Lovely. Okay, well, great to interact with all of you. Thank you for all of your input as well. It's really nice for people to be able to sort of share their journey, their challenges, but also a bit of tenacity as well, motivation to just go and do it, because you've got rights associated with Code of Practice and the EHC plan, and things can look up if you challenge the local authority. Thank you very much. We'll send this out and hopefully see you all next week for the annual review webinar. Thank you.